I saw this story down in Orange County, California. This guy gave helicopter tours 30 years without incident. Hands the business off to his son. The American dream. I built it up for 30 years. Here you go, son. Make the family and the family name proud. All right, Dad, I love you. Right? This poor kid, 5 days in. He's supposed to give a tour to a couple. Only the dude shows up. The kid thought it was weird, but he's like, I need the money. I got to give him a tour. Right? So he takes this guy up. 10 minutes into the tour, the dude fucking jumped out. Yeah. 5 fucking days later, this kid, he probably barely had the speech down. Just sitting there flying the helicopter. All right, if you look out the left side of the aircraft, that's Orange County. There's over 27 miles of beaches. Put your seatbelt back on. 27 miles of beaches. Was established as a county in 1903. Sir, please don't open the door, sir. What are you doing? Sir, no! What the fuck? What the fuck? Oh, my God!
Good morning. It's Thursday, Delta Force Thursday, January the 4th, and this is The True Conservative. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the Serenity Prayer and the patriotic song of the day, we will have the motivational shorts, the patriotic shorts, Bishop Barron, Ayn Rand, the 33 Strategies of War, and Inside Delta Force. All that and more when I get back.
God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I shouldn't change, the courage to change the things I should, and the wisdom to know the difference.
Torito presents Brunch Auténtico. Create your own weekend brunch.
Thank you. And now, the military shorts.
Many people think that American pilots scored the F-14's first air-to-air kill, but the truth is, it was Iran. Here's what happened. In the early days of the Iran-Iraq War, a group of 5 Iraqi attack helicopters had pushed into Iran and were firing on border posts. In response, 2 Iranian F-14s were sent out to shoot them down. As the pair of F-14s approached the helicopters, they fired off their AIM-9 Sidewinder missiles, but missed. At that point, they should have turned around, at least according to modern rules of engagement, which say close-quarter combat isn't worth the risk for an expensive fighter like the F-14, especially against something as deadly as a fully armed attack helicopter. But the Iranian pilots went in with their machine guns blazing, and after 400 rounds ripped through one of the helicopters, it exploded in a burst of fire. That was September 7th, 1980. It was not until 1981, nearly a year later, that F-14s flown by American pilots achieved their first air-to-air kill.
It's March 1918, and on a French battlefield near the town of Amiens, Australian soldiers come across a weeping boy, kneeling over his dead parents, both killed by shell fire. He's bleeding heavily from shrapnel wounds and speaks only enough English to convey that he's now alone, an orphan. His name is Jean Berthe, and his story is one of the most remarkable from the Great War. The Aussies take him in, and when their battalion moves on, young Jean goes with them. He becomes a fixture among the troops, running errands and winning their hearts. They even make John a little Australian uniform. It's Armistice Day, time to return home, except nobody wants to part with the boy. Bob Simpsons, a fisherman with 6 kids already, risks court-martial and jail time and smuggles John into Australia. John learns English, marries an Aussie, and spends the rest of his life there. He's simply known as Johnny the Frenchman to the townspeople.
Operation Goat Rope. There's a goat herder that brings his goats in front of my little compound every night to take back to their goat pen. So I wanted to use all these goats as a counter IED tool to funnel them down the road.
That's genius. Did you do it?
Yeah.
How'd you do it?
So we had the goats. Our engineers built a goat pen. So we took all these goats and promised the goat herder that we'd pay him, and he was like, no problem.
How many goats are we talking here?
130
Holy
something. maxed out, dude. In the morning when we took off on the mission, the goats led the route down the road and functioned all the IEDs minus one. There was one that still got functioned later in the day with the goats on the way back, that we all made it over on the way there. That's what's crazy about IEDs, is that there's legacy IEDs, there's older ones, there's newer ones, there's ones that are more sensitive, there's ones that you might be able to step on and not function, but that the next guy might function it.
The deaths by gun violence, the average person hearing that pictures 38 to 40,000 murders. You must understand that figure includes criminals killed by police in the line of duty. It includes criminals killed in self-defense by their intended victims who fought back and prevailed. Which means every one of those, yes, it's a death. Yes, it's a death by a gun. Every one of those represents an innocent life saved. We also have to realize that that figure, that 38 to 40,000 dead by the gun, includes a minimum 60%, and some years as many as 2/3, that were suicides. And those situations, I respectfully submit, should be taken out of the mix. When the other side has to pad their arguments, and we can show they've padded their arguments, we have taken a big bite out of their credibility.
He told his mother he was going to stay with some relatives in San Diego for the summer. Instead, he forged her signature and enlisted in the Navy. His name was Calvin Graham, and at 12 years old, he was the youngest American combatant during World War II. Young Calvin was a gunner aboard the USS South Dakota during the 4-day naval battle of Guadalcanal, when shrapnel tore through his jaw, knocking out all his teeth and leaving him bleeding profusely. Rather than tend to his own wounds, he worked feverishly to save those around him. I took belts off the dead and made tourniquets for the living, Calvin would recall years later. It was a long night. It aged me. 38 men would die that night, and the 12-year-old was awarded the Bronze Star and a Purple Heart for his heroics. His mother saw newsreel footage of her son and turned him in. Calvin would spend 3 months in the brig and was stripped of all his medals and was dishonorably discharged. It would take 50 years before his medals were posthumously restored.
3 Marines picked me up in a Jeep with a machine gun on the back, and I climbed in, and Scotty, the sergeant that was the driver, handed me his M16 and said, "Welcome to the NOM, Doc. Do you know how to use this?" And I said, "I do." He said, "Okay, let's go." And I had one Marine in the back scouting around looking, and the other guy standing behind the machine gun. And it's because, as I later found out, that Da Nang was off limits for us because there were snipers everywhere, waiting for troops to come into Da Nang. And this is the second largest city in all of Vietnam. And of course, it was guerrilla warfare. You'd expect snipers, of course. But it's not what the American people tended to think. They were still stuck on what conventional warfare looks like. They didn't get guerrilla warfare. A war where there was no Geneva Conventions. There were no rules, which showed up a lot in what happened.
A Russian pilot stole a fighter jet and escaped all the way to the United States with one sneaky trick. Let me explain. At a remote Soviet airbase along the Black Sea's northeast coast, there was a pilot called Alexander Zuyev. His career quickly took a turn when he tried to do the impossible: hijack a MiG-29 Fulcrum fighter jet, one of the Soviet Union's best aircraft at the time. It wasn't easy to get past the guards, and he got shot in his right arm. But eventually, he overpowered the guards and took off. Crossing into Turkish airspace, Zuyev asked for permission to land, but his request was denied. However, he tried again, this time at a different airbase in northeastern Turkey, and it worked. Desperate for safety, Zuyev appealed for political asylum in the U.S., making things difficult between the USSR and Turkey. The Soviets demanded that Zuyev and the hijacked plane must return, but due to his determination, Zuyev actually got the chance to become an American and was offered immigration. This was the world's fastest bomber that could reach Mach 3, but it had one big problem. Let me explain. Meet the U.S. Air Force's XB-70 Valkyrie. Its 6 engines allowed it to reach Mach 3, making it the largest and fastest bomber created. Except this giant never got to the production stage. All that remains today is a prototype in a museum. This 196-foot-long bomber stood 31 feet tall at the tail, weighing a staggering 521,000 pounds at its peak. Made with stainless steel honeycomb panels and titanium, the Valkyrie used a technique called compression lift, so when flying at supersonic speeds, its shock wave supported part of its weight. This aircraft was made to destroy Soviet air defenses during a nuclear conflict and cause destruction. But here's the problem. The project was too risky. One of the prototypes had a mid-air collision. Weapons like ballistic missiles looked like they would be the future, making funding and development for this supersonic aircraft come to a stop.
Always told me, Mike, learn how to be a good listener. Don't shoot from the hip. Don't talk when you shouldn't be talking. Keep your mouth shut. Right. Listen. He drummed it into my head. So when I started reading Proverbs, I saw that there was so many passages about keeping your mouth shut, about silence. So I thought it would be a good topic today because so many people, Chaz, get themselves in trouble by just talking out of turn.
Yes.
Our whole life was destroyed. People talking on tape, people talking, to undercover agents. I'll tell you this crazy, and then we can get into it. When we were in the house, my dad was afraid that the house was bugged when it was being built. Turned out to be right. They put a bug in the house, in the kitchen.
He smashed a tie-breaking home run in the bottom of the seventh to propel the Red Sox to victory in front of a packed Fenway Park, something fans had grown accustomed to. It was April 30th, 1952, but it wasn't just another day at the park for Ted Williams. It would be his last at bat for 18 months. 2 days later, he would be at Willow Grove Air Station in Pennsylvania, recalled to active duty from the Marine Corps Reserves and learning how to fly an F-9F Panther jet. In his first mission, flying as wingman for John Glenn, Williams' plane was hit by anti-aircraft fire, knocking out his hydraulics and electronics and forcing him to make a dangerous belly landing. Williams would go on to fly 39 combat missions in Korea, earning the Air Medal with 2 gold stars. Glenn described Williams as one of the best pilots he ever knew. Ted Williams returned to Fenway on August 6, 1953,
and that was the military shorts. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, some stoicism. Act as if nothing bothers you.
Principle number 1. Listen twice as much as you speak. Have you ever thought about why nature gave us 2 ears, but only 1 mouth? According to Epictetus, there is no error or coincidence in this, but rather a clear purpose behind this reality, not to fall in love with our voice as much as we are called to fall in love with the voice of others. It is by learning from others that we advance in life, not by repeating our own speech over and over again. So from today, start paying more attention to what people around you say and less to what you have been upholding until now. Principle number 2, always expect the worst. One of the biggest causes of anxiety and its devastating consequences is believing that unfavorable circumstances are waiting for us in the future. We fear that our children will abandon their studies, that we will be fired from work, that our spouse will confess to us that they have been having an affair with someone else and ask us for a divorce, or that something else bad will happen to us, such as going bankrupt. The problem is that one day we fear one of these problems, and the next day another, and another. The path of life, in addition to reserving good and happy parts for us, also reserves a handful of problems that are inevitable. Therefore, we live in permanent stress, caused by different stimuli each day. And this is where Epictetus comes into the picture, since his proposal is as drastic as it is effective. He says, think that all these things you fear so much have already happened. So, what could be worse? In this way, your spirit will develop coping strategies to move forward with your head held high. Principle number 3. Prepare to fail because it is the only way to progress. We do the impossible so that we are not considered fools. But Epictetus has another view on this. According to his philosophy, one of the best things that can happen to you is to be considered such, as this is the way for you to really improve professionally and personally as well. The Stoic philosopher reminds us that overcoming is not the product of a spontaneous reaction, but rather the result of a long path of trial and error, for it is through error that we can polish what distances us from excellence. Principle number 4, be aware of the dangers of fortune. This wealth that we desire brings with it a stigma from which few people can free themselves. And it's not just about the people who will emerge from nowhere to benefit from our fortune, like by pretending a friendship they don't feel for us. Money has the ability to transform people, and not necessarily for the better. Once we are possessors of this highly coveted resource, we come to have something that until then we did not know we had. And it is from that moment that our spirit may begin to poison itself in the face of the loss of moral values. Principle number 5, do not cling to a single hope. Fortunately, we are beings inclined to practice diversity. That is, there is no reason to put all our hopes in a single dream, since this could be devastating if we fail in it. Therefore, Epictetus encourages us to pursue many dreams, as this will exponentially increase our chances of success. Principle number 6, always remember that death is waiting at the end of the road. This is not advice that calls us to pessimism, but to be aware that death is the final destination of all our actions, and especially our efforts. Once we have this in mind, perhaps we will start to evaluate to what extent it is worth spending 20 years of our limited life saving to pay for a house that, as much as it weighs on us, we will not be able to take with us wherever we go. Once death visits us, just as we carry in our bag those objects that we consider indispensable for our daily life, such as the phone, credit cards, and our toothbrush, it would greatly benefit us to carry a small notebook with these Stoic principles, because thanks to them, we will no longer see setbacks as misfortunes, nor life as eternal time we have at our disposal, but we will acquire a more realistic view of our existence, and certainly make better use of our time of life. Principle number 7, true wealth lies in a contented spirit. Due to the Stoicism, Epictetus had his particular conception of happiness, and we can know it through one of his famous phrases. A wise man is one who does not fret over the things he does not have, but rejoices in those he does have. This reflection is more than a thought. It is advice to learn to stop feeling afflicted by those riches that are not yet part of our life. Because while we allow ourselves to complain and mourn for what we lack, we lose valuable minutes of happiness in which we could thank for everything we have achieved so far, which is much more than our eyes are trained to appreciate. Thus, a rich person is above all a happy person. Principle number 8. Incorporate humility into your life. If you really want to learn something, it is essential that a person learns what they believe they already know. Through this phrase, Epictetus calls us to make use of our humility, especially in the realm of learning. Going through life, boasting of the pride of knowledge, distances us more and more from the authentic knowledge that arises from the conviction that we are completely ignorant about what we intend to learn. In this way, we will look at everything through the eyes of a child, which harbor as much capacity for wonder as they do a desire to learn. Principle number 9. Guilt is synonymous with plague. Narrow-minded people blame others. Ordinary people blame themselves, but the wise see all guilt as foolishness. Thanks to this phrase from Epictetus, therapists nowadays have begun to approach guilt as a feeling to be eradicated from our lives. The only way to win the competition against guilt is to refuse to play with it. The problem is that it results in an easy path, since by blaming others or ourselves, we completely absolve ourselves of the responsibility to correct the mistake. Therefore, resorting to it is a temptation that is hard to escape. Only those people, driven by a firm determination to overcome, are capable of avoiding guilt and still manage to take responsibility for their actions. Principle number 10. Make alliances with winning people. It's curious how, when someone sneezes next to us, we immediately move away, invaded by the fear that they will infect us. However, we are not so cautious to avoid one of the most lethal contagions we are exposed to daily. Epictetus left us a wise piece of advice about this. Surround ourselves with people who make us want to give our best, because people's behavior greatly influences our state of mind. There are people who drain our energy and ruin our day, while others leave us full of joy and vigor. Therefore, one of the smartest decisions we can make is to ally ourselves with those who bring good vibes into our lives, while we say goodbye to those who have the ability to make us regret being born. Principle number 11. Never forget that your reactions forge your destiny. We should not take our reactions lightly, as they are definitely what mark our success or our failure. And Epictetus was very categorical about this. He taught us that we do not have the possibility to choose what happens, but how to manage it. Misfortune can fall upon any of us, but it is what we do from its arrival that will mark the difference from that moment on. For some people, a divorce means entering the world of depression and victimization. In contrast, for Epictetus, it is a golden opportunity to start on the path of self-knowledge. Remember that your life is not what happens to you, but what you do with it. Principle number 12. Always fulfill your duty. Each one of us has a role in society and in the world, and the sun does not need praise or enchantments to rise each morning. But it does every day, and that's final. Thus, just as every part of nature does its job, we must fulfill our obligations. If we are waiting for please or praise to do our work, we are failing both the environment to which we belong and ourselves. If we know what our task is and are aware that other people depend on it, it is our moral duty to carry it out without waiting for anyone to remind us. Principle number 13. Do not hate those who hate you, simply ignore them. You are much bigger and completely superior to the one who criticizes, despises, and discriminates against you. Therefore, do not waste your precious time hating that person, as they do not even deserve to be present in your thoughts. We are encouraged not to fear people who harm you, as that noise represents a regrettable attempt to damage you, so ignore it and become immune to it. Principle number 14. Bet on simplicity. Why live in frugality if, nowadays, we have the possibility to surround ourselves with all kinds of luxuries? The answer is much simpler and more logical than you think. Because wealth does not maintain itself, but requires commitment and a lot of daily energy to be able to preserve this system of luxuries and wealth. In contrast, when we opt for a simple lifestyle, we stop being surrounded by the pressure of having to meet the due dates of bills, loans, and credit cards. Principle number...
I love hotels that look expensive but are actually cheap. This is a 4-star hotel. It was beautiful.
Due dates of bills, loans, and credit cards. Principle number 15. When you allow the comments and attitudes of others to bother you, you are handing over control of your life. Any person capable of making you angry becomes your master. However, that person can only make you angry when you allow yourself to be disturbed by them. Epictetus makes us understand that there are many keys within us, and some lead us to happiness, while others lead us directly to emotional ruin. And it is precisely this last key that we hand over to those who make us angry. The solution to this problem is to put up a barrier that prevents us from being affected by the attitudes of others. Because, definitely, each one is the owner of what they say, and also of what they decide to listen to. Principle number 16. Friendship is above wealth. True wealth is genuine friends, as they will be there to support us if one day our material fortune dissipates. Therefore, dedicate yourself to cultivating true friendships, and you will be making a very profitable long-term investment. Principle number 17. Always extract the benefit from things. Whatever happens, it is up to you to take advantage of it or not. These were the words of Epictetus. As you can see, it is not about having the option to take the good out of adversity, but that doing so is our duty. As long as there is intelligence in you, there will be the ability to realize the advantages you can take from the situation that has struck you. Imagine that one day you arrive at work to find out you will be fired. Instead of despairing and accusing the universe of being against you, you have the option of venturing into that enterprise you dreamt of while fulfilling your work schedule alongside people you disliked. Therefore, always try to look for the positive in a situation, as this movement added up throughout your life will certainly take you further than just lamenting. Principle number 18. Stop worrying about what is out of your control. You are the owner of your opinion, but not your reputation. You have the desire and the zeal for the search, but you cannot control the amount of goods you have or success. Therefore, worrying and getting bitter about those things we cannot control is simply making the decision to waste time. According to Epictetus, we are called to cultivate those values that we have the possibility to change. But it is also our responsibility to let go of what is out of our control, and thus let fate take care of it. In addition to being incredibly useful for everyday life, Stoic principles are teachings that can help us navigate bad times with interest and resilience, as there is no place in their philosophy for fantasizing, but only for applying what is learned and moving forward. I hope you liked the video, and since you've made it to the end, share your ideas.
And that was a little bit of Stoicism. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, the next part of Chapter 7 from the 33 Strategies of War.
By Xenophon. You know, I am sure, that not numbers or strength brings victory in war, but whichever army goes into battle stronger in soul, their enemies generally cannot withstand them. Historical examples. 1. In the early 1630s, Oliver Cromwell, 1599 to 1658, a provincial gentleman farmer in Cambridgeshire, England, fell victim to a depression and to constant thoughts of death. Deep in crisis, he converted to the Puritan religion, and suddenly his life took a new turn. He felt he had experienced a direct communion with God. Now he believed in providence, the idea that everything happens for a reason and according to God's will. Whereas before he had been despondent and indecisive, now he was filled with purpose. He thought himself among God's elect. Eventually, Cromwell became a member of Parliament and a vocal defender of the common people in their grievances against the aristocracy. Yet he felt marked by providence for something larger than politics. He had visions of a great crusade. In 1642, Parliament, in a bitter struggle with Charles I, voted to cut off the king's funds until he agreed to limits on royal power. When Charles refused, civil war broke out between the Cavaliers, supporters of the king who wore their hair long, and the Roundheads, the rebels, so called because they cropped their hair short. Parliament's most fervent supporters were Puritans like Cromwell, who saw the war against the king as his chance. More than his chance, his calling. Although Cromwell had no military background, he hurriedly formed a troop of 60 horsemen from his native Cambridgeshire. His aim was to incorporate them in a large regiment, gain military experience by fighting under another commander, and slowly prove his worth. He was confident of ultimate victory, for he saw his side as unbeatable. After all, God was on their side, and all his men were believers in the cause of creating a more pious England. Despite his lack of experience, Cromwell was something of a military visionary. He imagined a new kind of warfare spearheaded by a faster, more mobile cavalry, and in the war's first few months, he proved a brave and effective leader. He was given more troops to command, but soon realized that he had grossly overestimated the fighting spirit of those on his side.
Time and again he led cavalry charges that pierced enemy lines, only to watch in disgust as his soldiers broke order to plunder the enemy camp. Sometimes he tried to hold part of his force in reserve to act as reinforcements later in the battle, but the only command they listened to was to advance, and in retreat they were hopelessly disordered. Representing themselves as crusaders, Cromwell's men were revealed by battle as mercenaries, fighting for pay and adventure. They were useless. In 1643, when Cromwell was made a colonel at the head of his own regiment, he decided to break with the past. From now on, he would recruit only soldiers of a certain kind, men who, like himself, had experienced religious visions and revelations. He sounded out the aspirants, tested them for the depth of their faith. Departing from a long tradition, he appointed commoners, not aristocrats, as officers. As he wrote to a friend, "I had rather have a plain russet-coated captain that knows what he fights for and loves what he knows, than that which you call a gentleman and is nothing else." Cromwell made his recruits sing psalms and pray together. In a stern check on bad discipline, he taught them to see all their actions as part of God's plan. And he looked after them in an unusual way for the times, making sure they were well-fed, well-clothed, and promptly paid. When Cromwell's army went into battle, it was now a force to reckon with. The men rode in tight formation, loudly singing psalms. As they neared the king's forces, they would break into a pretty round trot, not the headlong and disorderly charge of other troops. Even in contact with the enemy, they kept their order, and they retreated with as much discipline as when they advanced. Since they believed that God was with them, they had no fear of death. They could march straight up a hill into enemy fire without breaking step. Having gained control over his cavalry, Cromwell could maneuver them with infinite flexibility. His troops won battle after battle. In 1645, Cromwell was named Lieutenant General of the Cavalry in the new model army. That year, at the Battle of Naseby, his disciplined regiment was crucial in the Roundheads' victory. A few days later, his cavalry finished off the Royalist forces at Langport, effectively putting an end to the first stage of the Civil War. Interpretation. That Cromwell is generally considered one of history's great military leaders is all the more remarkable given that he learned soldiery on the job. During the second stage of the Civil War, he became head of the Roundhead armies, and later, after defeating King Charles and having him executed, he became Lord Protector of England. Although he was ahead of his times with his visions of mobile warfare, Cromwell was not a brilliant strategist or field tactician. His success lay in the morale and discipline of his cavalry, and the secret to those was the quality of the men he recruited, true believers in his cause. Such men were naturally open to his influence and accepting of his discipline. With each new victory, they grew more committed to him and more cohesive. He could ask the most of them. Above all else, then, pay attention to your staff, to those you recruit to your cause. Many will pretend to share your beliefs, but your first battle will show that all they wanted was a job. Soldiers like these are mercenaries and will get you nowhere. True believers are what you want. Expertise and impressive resumes matter less than character and the capacity for sacrifice. Recruits of character will give you a staff already open to your influence, making morale and discipline infinitely easier to attain. This core personnel will spread the gospel for you, keeping the rest of the army in line. As far as possible in this secular world, make battle a religious experience and ecstatic involvement in something transcending the present. 2. In 1931, the 23-year-old Lyndon Baines Johnson was offered the kind of job he had been dreaming of, secretary to Richard Clayburgh, newly elected congressman from Texas's 14th congressional district. Johnson was a high school debating teacher at the time, but he had worked on several political campaigns and was clearly a young man of ambition. His students at Sam Houston High in Houston, Texas, assumed that he would quickly forget about them, but to the surprise of two of his best debaters, L.E. Jones and Gene Latimer, he not only kept in touch, He wrote to them regularly from Washington. 6 months later came a bigger surprise still. Johnson invited Jones and Latimer to Washington to work as his assistants. With the Depression at its height, jobs were scarce, particularly jobs with this kind of potential. The two teenagers grabbed the opportunity. Little did they know what they were in for. The pay was ridiculously low, and it soon became clear that Johnson intended to work the two men to their human limit. They put in 18 or 20-hour days, mostly answering constituents' mail. The chief has a knack, or better said, a genius for getting the most out of those around him, Latimer later wrote. He'd say, "Gene, it seems L.E.'s a little faster than you today." And I'd work faster. "L.E., he's catching up with you." And pretty soon we'd both be pounding the typewriter for hours without stopping, just as fast as we could. Jones didn't usually take orders too well, but he found himself working harder and harder for Johnson. His boss seemed destined for something great. That Johnson would scale the heights of power was written all over his face, and he would bring the ambitious Jones along with him. Johnson could also turn everything into a cause, making even the most trivial issue a crusade for Kleberg's constituents.
And that was the next part of Chapter 7 from the 33 Strategies of War. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now Bishop Robert Barron.
Everything in this world finally has this quality of evanescence. It doesn't last. So yeah, I've labored like crazy, built up this business. I made a lot of money. That's a good thing. It's not going to last because you're going to fade away and it's all going to go to somebody else. Should I just be depressed then? No. I should be detached. Yeah, it's good. Wealth, power, pleasure. Take it in and then let it go. Enjoy it. Sure, the way you enjoy like a firework going off. Boom, there it is. Look how beautiful that burst of light and color. And then it's gone. Do I despair? No, I just kind of learn to live in that present moment, savoring what I can, but also letting go. Why? Because I realize that the true good, the truly beautiful, belongs to a higher world. I can sense it in these things, but none of the things in the world last. And so if I cling to them, they disappear. Wear the world lightly.
And that was Bishop Robert Barron. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, the Ayn Rand thought of the day. Quote, "The world conflict of today is the conflict of the individual against the state, the same conflict that has been fought throughout mankind's history. The names change, but the essence and the results remain the same. Whether it is the individual against feudalism or against absolute monarchy or against communism or fascism or Nazism or socialism or the welfare state." Unquote. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now from CNN News Central. Come on here.
Testimony last month in making clear that she believes the campaign against her was driven, at least in part, by her skin color. This is what she wrote. "My inbox has been flooded with invective, including death threats. I've been called the N-word more times than I care to count."
So this is, again, when you hear this, somebody is just great talking point for the left. And you go to work and somebody says, President Gay had got death threats. She's been called the N-word. These are arbitrary claims. She produces no evidence whatsoever. She's demanding that you take her word for it. And you don't have to do that. Okay? So, again, the ways that you can deal with this, somebody comes up to you at work with this kind of thing, is say, where's the proof? Where's the proof that she said any of these things? Or that she had death threats? Or that people used the N-word with her? Do you mean the N-word? And by the way, what does the N-word mean? Does that mean not qualified, you could do that too. So it's an arbitrary claim, and if you try to argue with an arbitrary claim and try to come out and say, no, it didn't happen, or, oh, well, but those are extremists, you lose. You lose right away. The burden of proof is on, in this particular case, President Gay, or former President Gay. It is up to her to prove that she's gotten death threats, prove that people have used the N-word, et cetera, and invective and all the other things that she claims. She has to prove it. Show it to us. And then we go from there. So don't be intimidated by arbitrary claims. And the left does this all the time. They make an arbitrary claim, then they'll back it up with another arbitrary claim, then they'll back it up with another arbitrary claim, and they never bother to produce any evidence or proof. Back in a minute.
Thank you. And now, something a little bit different. Normally I'm commenting on newscasts, if you will, or commentary platforms that are supposedly on the right, from Fox News, CNBC, that kind of thing. So now I'm going to move into commentary on left-wing, CNN and MSNBC. So this is MSNBC's Morning Joe.
Amid the possibility of former President Trump's return to the White House, new reporting is shining a light on how he allegedly used his presidential powers and what it could mean for a potential second term. The New York Times reports, on his final day in office, Trump granted clemency to a convicted marijuana trafficker named Jonathan Braun. Quote, at the time, Trump's own Justice Department and federal regulators, as well as New York state authorities, were still after Mr. Braun for his role in an entirely separate matter. His work as a predatory lender, making what judges later found were fraudulent and usurious loans to cash-strapped small businesses. According to the Times, Braun was put on Trump's radar by Charles Kushner, father of Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, and Trump's commutation hurt a broader criminal investigation by his own Justice Department into predatory lending.
Let's bring in Michael.
So the fascinating thing, of course, first and foremost, is that January 1st, 2024, they're talking about Donald Trump. These people they can't live without Donald Trump. Donald Trump needs to live forever. Otherwise, because as soon as he disappears from the scene politically or otherwise, their show will disappear along with him. Because MSNBC, CNN, they just, I don't know. I mean, they just can't stop themselves talking on and on. Everything is about Donald Trump all day, every day. So that's the first thing. Second thing is that if anybody comes to you, because what they're doing here is giving their useful idiots, these folks that are on the air, although these two with Morning Joe, Kaczynski or Flinsky or whatever her name is, and Joe, what's his name, is they are, I was going to say, the down for the struggle types. Normally that's the case. They would be down for the struggle, but they're giving talking points to the useful idiots that are watching their show, so that when those useful idiots go to work, they see you in the break room, they're going to go ahead and give you, hey, did you hear that Donald Trump pardoned a guy that was, which they didn't give much play to, was a dope smuggler, and then, but they really played up the idea that he was a predatory lender. But anyway, so if they come to you with this talking point, hey, he pardoned a predatory lender, so what kind of a presidency is he, do you think? The first thing you do is you say, no, he didn't. You don't want to concede anything with these folks, because once you do, you're screwed. You can't win the argument. So everything that they're talking about, they make them prove it. And the way best and easiest and shortest way to make them prove it is simply to say, no, he didn't. No, he did not. We don't have to take their word for it. That's what they're doing right here. It's a fallacy called take my word for it. Now, they claim that the New York Times said it, but again, that's just another arbitrary claim. So when people at work, the lefties at your job come to you and say, guess what, Donald Trump did this, you just simply say, no, he didn't. And then look at them, you're going to notice they're just going to stare at you because they always figure that the conservatives are always going to take their word for it and then argue about it and try to argue, well, but he was justified because. No, don't do that. Make them prove it. Make them prove all of this. The arbitrary claim number one, that he pardoned somebody that was a dope smuggler and somebody that was a predatory lender. Number two is that it was done at the behest of the father of his son-in-law, Jared Kushner. That's another arbitrary claim. So it's another thing you can deny. Sorry, never happened. If they come back, well, the New York Times said, sorry, no, they didn't. Okay? If they try to produce something in the way of evidence, here's the article or something, you ask them, what is this supposed to prove? You make them earn it. If the left is going to win, make them earn it. So again, this was from Morning Joe, January the 1st, 2024. Back in a minute.
Thank you. And now, inside Delta Force.
There are few armies in the world that would not have killed them outright, but our feelings for those people were, but for the grace of God, they could be our own families or friends. By the time we had them searched and seated on the side of the road, the other planes were slashing in out of the darkness, and soon there were people all over the place. We decided to kidnap the bus passengers. We would load them on one of the C-130s for backhaul out of the country that night and fly them back in for release after the mission was completed. Major Fitch detailed my team to stand guard over the passengers, since we were the ones who had initially taken control of them. I finished searching the prisoners by the light of the burning tanker. After we seated them on a low ridge of dirt edging the track, Bill Oswalt and I stepped to the end of the line to take a quick breather and compare notes. We stood mesmerized in the desert night, watching the flaming tanker in this remote part of an ancient world. The column of fire soaring some 300 feet into the sky was absolutely biblical. I was certain the glow could be seen for 100 miles across the Iranian desert. Bill, do you think this mission is compromised? I asked. Bill nodded toward the tanker. Eric, I'll bet Ray Charles could see that damned thing. And then, glancing at the seated passengers cum prisoners, he said, just think of it, Eric. For a year, we worked like dogs to become America's counter-terrorist outfit, and what do we do on our very first mission? We hijack a fucking bus. Every group of human beings has a few members who stand out, and our guests were no exception. One was a little boy about 5 years old. He sat right next to his grandmother, and even though it was obvious he was scared, he put on a stern face and made it clear he was ready to defend his grandma if anyone threatened her. Another was the brave guy, now flex-cuffed, who had punched Logan in the nose. And last, but certainly not least, was the one we quickly dubbed the village idiot. In our very limited Farsi, we had learned about 20 phrases, we told the people to sit still and shut up. But there's always one person who doesn't get the message. Ours was a poor guy in his mid-20s who was slightly but obviously limited in his mental faculties. He would lean over to talk to his neighbor in a loud whisper, and his cringing neighbor would lean away, gesturing to him to shut up, and surely telling the guy between gritted teeth that he would get them all killed. Twice I had walked over to the young man to tell him to be quiet. The second time I stuck the muzzle of my Car 15 under his nose to emphasize the point. He was silent for at least a minute, and then went at it again. This time, as I charged over to him, his neighbors on either side rolled away in self-protection. He looked up with horror on his face when I jammed my weapon's muzzle under his left ear, heaved him up on tiptoes, and frog-marched him up the road away from the group. He was convinced he was being taken away for execution, and I'm sure his comrades thought the same. As I led him away from the group of prisoners, he set up a kind of pitiable wailing it seems only Middle Easterners are capable of. He squalled and slobbered and begged and beseeched, all with upraised hands clasped in prayer, as I marched him 20 meters away, turned him so his back was to his friends, pushed him to the ground, and left him to sit alone. I could hear him snuffling and mumbling what were probably prayers of thanksgiving or curses for his deliverance from certain death as I walked back to my position near the rest of his comrades. In the glow of the fire, the faces of the passengers all looked relieved, whether from the fact that their fellow traveler had not been killed or that he could no longer get the rest of them in trouble, I wasn't sure. So there we all were. A nice fire to keep off the chill, some new friends to keep us company, but no helicopters. The tanker C-130s were arriving now, and the birds that had brought us in needed to leave. But Colonel Kyle, the air commander, would keep them with us until the helos arrived, just in case. Hours ticked by. We were burning precious darkness, and still no choppers. Several times we thought we detected them, but it was just our wishful thinking. Then, suddenly, high in the sky, too high in fact, we saw one. He had his lights on and was making his way to the flaming beacon we had lit. Close behind him came the rest, but it turned out we were short one bird. One had developed some sort of engine trouble as soon as it crossed the shoreline of the Persian Gulf and had turned back for the carrier. The rest of the flight had forged ahead, straight into a haboob, a storm of very fine dust particles that can tower thousands of feet into the sky. This was the undoing of the helicopter force. The commander of the naval aviators was a badly shaken man when he arrived. He was obviously rattled, and I heard him say that he had never been through anything like that in his life. His demeanor was that of a man looking for a way out. He was led away to a conference with Colonels Kyle and Beckwith. While the powwow was going on, another pilot ran up to report that his bird was showing transmission warning lights and was not flyable. The plan called for 6 helos to go forward from Desert 1. We expected that at least one would fail to crank at the Hyde site because they were notoriously difficult to start on their own power. We were now down to 5 helicopters, with the expectation of losing at least one more. Things seemed to be steadily disintegrating, but we had come so far, and Tehran was now so close. A radio call was placed to Major General James Vaught, the task force commander, to advise him of the situation. He wisely left the decision-making to the commanders on the ground. Even under the best of circumstances, Charlie Beckwith was not known for his patience, but he had controlled himself pretty well up till now. But as he listened to the pilots talking themselves out of going forward, he had enough. All right, God damn it. Let's get the hell out. Scrub the mission for tonight. We'll return to Masirah and the Nimitz while we still have darkness. Reconfigure and come back tomorrow night. Radio Dick Meadows about the situation and load up on the tanker planes for the trip out. Okay, do it. The tanker we boarded was refueling 3 of the helicopters as we climbed inside. A C-130 tanker carries the fuel in huge, flat rubber bladders that completely cover the floor of the aircraft, and these are what we sprawled out on. Think of it as sitting on a carpet made of 20,000 pounds of jet fuel. But at least the outsides of the fuel bladders were dry. The interiors of the helicopters always ran with dripping fuel and hydraulic fluid, making it hard to even walk in them. The Air Force put up with no such sloppiness. We scattered throughout the plane by teams. Our 4-man team, Bill, Chris, Mike, and myself, settled against the fuselage just forward of the left wheel well and relaxed a little. It was hot inside the plane, so we shucked off our black field jackets and put them behind our backs as padding between ourselves and the metal points and edges sticking out of the inner wall of the plane. We also wedged our car-15s between the edge of the bladders and the skin of the aircraft so they wouldn't rattle all over the place during takeoff. We would need both hands to hang on with. Getting off the ground was going to be a lot rougher than the landing. Finally, the helicopters were refueled and the plane was closed up and readied for takeoff. The whole time the C-130s were on the ground, their engines ran at full RPM, but with the props feathered. So to those of us inside, there was really no difference in sound between a plane in flight and one on the ground. A number of my mates were already asleep when we felt the plane start to move forward. But then something went terribly wrong. Just as we lurched forward, as if the brakes had been released, a storm of blue sparks exploded overhead and up front. My first thought was that the bank of electronics between the flight deck and the cargo hold had shorted out, and here we were, sitting on all this jet fuel. My initial frantic thought was, where's the nearest fire extinguisher? I glanced about for its location. Then, things started happening in fragments of seconds. The universe switched to slow motion, as it often appears to me when my life is in dire jeopardy. While the sparks were still flying, the crew door of the plane blew in with an explosion and a wave of fire. Willie Corman was sitting in the hole of the stairwell to the flight deck, just in front of the crew door, when it blew. But the flames turned upward instead of down, and he shot out of the hole like he'd been fired from a cannon. My teammate Chris jumped to his feet and yelled, "Haul ass!" At that instant, the flight deck erupted with a blast of fire, and the ceiling over our heads in the forward part of the cabin was engulfed in roaring flames. My first thought was that it was useless to even try to move. I was sitting on 10 tons of jet fuel. I was a lifetime forward of the aft jump doors, and there was no way I'd ever make it out. My next thought was, to hell with that, I've got to try. So I took and held a deep breath I fully expected would be my last, and started moving. It seems ironic now, but during the extensive psychological testing we underwent during selection, I remember being asked the question, "What are you afraid of?" I didn't hesitate to answer, "Fire. I fear it above anything else." A quick glance aft showed that most of the squadron was already jammed up near the right rear jump door 40 feet away. It wasn't open yet, but even if it were, I'd never get there before the flames poured over me. In the split second it had taken for me to get to my feet, the flames had burned through the top of the fuselage and were cascading down the walls. I turned and ripped the blackout cover off a porthole midway down the left side. Nothing but fire outside. I continued down the left side of the plane just ahead of the cataract of flame. I was in a race for my life, and the fire matched me step for step. I made it to the back of the plane, just ahead of the flames, to the left jump door. I grabbed the handle and gave it a heave. When it cracked loose from the floor, a wide, flat sheet of flame gushed inside, and Don Feeney yelled at me, "Close that fucking door!" I slammed it shut, and momentarily denied entry to that torrent of fire. While I was hurtling down the left side of the plane, our squadron sergeant major, Del Rainey, quenched the initial confusion with a short command, "Fall in, boys, and hit the door like a jump." That's what everyone did, and that's what saved us. The logjam at the door cleared immediately, and the line moved with fire hose urgency, just like we were jumping on a short drop zone. Dell's calmness and presence of mind saved many of us. I know it saved me. When I turned from slamming the left door shut, the line on the other side had only 3 or 4 men in it, and they disappeared as I plunged straight across the plane and followed them through the hope of that open door. By the time I got there, it was ringed with fire down to the level of the floor. Fire was just starting to eat at the rubber fuel bladders, and I could see a frenzied hurricane of fire blowing outside that I still had to leap through. But I was out. I hit the ground on top of someone who had fallen. It was Lucky Willie, and together we scrambled away from that hellish inferno. Bounding to my feet, I released the breath I had been holding and sucked down a lungful of hot air. But I had to keep moving. I was being showered with burning fragments from the rapidly disintegrating C-130. I sprinted out about 50 meters, turned to face the plane, and flung myself down on the sand to view the catastrophe. It had probably only been 30 seconds since the initial explosion. A lifetime. I saw a body lying in the jump door of the furiously burning plane. Just at the moment I saw him, the bird seemed to hiccup. It looked like the flames took a short, deep breath and then spat the man out onto the desert sand. 2 other men ran up and dragged him away. That man was Air Force Sergeant Joe Byers. He had fallen down from the burning flight deck, so terribly burned he was barely able to call for help. Jeff Hauser and Paul Lowry heard Byers's faint cry. They threw their field jackets across their faces and ran back into the flames to drag him out. They had gotten into the door, but he was dead weight, and they had to drop him to save themselves. But it seemed the fire didn't like Joe's flavor and spit him out. What incredible luck. One of our mates, Frank McAllister, was sound asleep when the plane detonated. He woke up to a furiously burning aircraft and people diving out the jump door. In his confusion, Frank thought we had taken off while he was asleep and had been hit by something in flight. His first thought had been, where are the parachutes? And his next thought, where are those fools going? But he couldn't stay in the furnace of the plane, so he launched himself out the door in a hard-arched skydiving position, and, after a half-second of freefall, slammed into the ground. Several days later, I asked him what he thought he was going to do once he was out of the plane without a parachute. He answered, "One problem at a time, Sarge. One problem at a time." By now, the plane was almost consumed. The munitions inside were cooking off, and the 2 red-eye anti-aircraft missiles we carried had launched themselves out into the night sky. I thought we were under ground attack, and that the plane had been hit by rocket-propelled grenades. Trying my best to look dead, I was lying with the right side of my face in the dirt, watching with my left eye, with my right arm and .45 caliber pistol tucked underneath my body. I figured I'd wait like this for the ground assault force to come sweeping around the tail of the remains, let the first wave of troops go past me, hoping they weren't shooting the dead, then kill the last one and take his rifle. With a bit of luck, I might get a machine gunner. While I was running this through my mind, out of the corner of my eye, I saw my close friend, J.T. Robards, come running over. He dropped to the ground and threw an arm over me. "You all right?" he asked. "I thought you were dead." "Yeah, J.T., I'm fine. Just playing possum." And I told him my intention. "Wrong answer, Bubba," he replied. "We aren't under attack. The damn chopper hit us. Look." He pointed to the wreckage. That's when I finally noticed what was left of the helicopter on top of the plane, just as the whole flaming mass started to collapse. We got to our feet and started moving away. Other survivors of the collision were moving back toward where the other planes had been, calling, "Get aboard, the planes are taking off." It was no joke. They were taking off. Should we destroy the helicopters? The crews had abandoned them and were nowhere to be seen. "No, they're going to call in an airstrike to take care of them. Just get on the planes." By now, a half-dozen of us had linked up and were chasing after a taxiing C-130. But as we drew nearer, it closed its ramp and picked up speed, blinding us in its dust as it rolled for takeoff. JT yelled and pointed, "That's the last one. We have to catch it." And then I could see it through the dust. Someone was shining a light off the back of the ramp, searching back and forth across the desert. We ran to that light as hard as we could. The plane was picking up speed for takeoff. As we got close to the ramp of the moving plane, I saw Rodney Hedman hanging off the back, held at the knees by Logan Fitch. He was sweeping the desert with his headlamp, looking for strays. I was the last man dragged aboard just as the ramp closed and the plane moved into takeoff position. Damn, I was back aboard another fuel tanker. But anything was better than being left behind. On the takeoff run, we plowed straight across the dirt berm running along the roadway, bounced 5 feet into the air, smashed back down, but continued to gather speed until finally we were airborne. But where were all our teammates? Bill and I were together. "When did you last see Mike and Chris? Did they make it out?" "I think so. They were both in front of me, but I didn't see them outside. Did anyone else see them?" Everyone was looking for missing teammates. The plane had been consumed in less than a minute, and it had been impossible to know where everyone went. We got a list of those aboard our plane and gave it to the crew chief, asking that it be relayed to the other planes and that they do the same. He said he would do it when things settled down a bit. Don Feeney and Keith Parsons were taking care of the injured air crewman. His hands had been burnt to claws, and his face and head were charred and in pretty bad shape. To cool him down, they poured canteens of water over his flight suit, which was so hot it steamed when the water hit it. But he survived. His worst injuries were to his lungs. Thanks to reconstructive surgery, a year later, his hands looked fairly normal. Jesus Hotel Christ. This had been some night. Things had come apart like a $2 shirt. Daylight was coming on rapidly, and we were still a long way from friendly territory. How much worse was it going to get? Well, there was nothing I could do about any of it right now. I was just a passenger again. So like any good soldier, I curled up on top of the bladder and went to sleep. I came awake to shouting. "What the hell's going on now?" I asked. "The loadmaster said we're low on fuel and may not make it back. We're going to lower the ramp and throw out pumps, hoses, and anything else we can shove out of the plane. Maybe we can at least make it to the Persian Gulf and ditch her near a Navy ship." That's just great. Really what we needed to top off this extravaganza. I couldn't remember anyone ever surviving a C-130 ditching. This last act was going to be a real crowd pleaser. We threw out everything we didn't need to keep the plane in the air and hoped it would be enough. It was. We made it back to Masirah Island. I heard later that when the engines finally shut down, there was no measurable fuel in the tanks. Once on the ground, we took stock. Everyone in the squadron was still alive, a real gift after what had happened. Most of us were scorched, Jeff and Paul more than anyone else, but none of us were terribly burned. But what about the air crews? 3 Marines dead in the chopper. The pilot and the co-pilot had escaped unharmed. 5 killed on the flight deck of the C-130. Only 2 had escaped from up front, both badly burned. What the hell happened? That's when we found out that as the last chopper finished refueling, she had lifted off to move away. But the pilot became disoriented in the dust cloud and drifted too far to the right, so the blades of the helicopter had slashed through the top of the C-130. This pulled the chopper on top of the plane at its left wing root. At the impact, the huge auxiliary fuel tank in the cargo bay of the chopper exploded, bathing the plane in burning fuel. The plane's spinning props spread fuel all over itself, assisting in its own immolation. Beckwith gave the order to go aboard a C-141 that was waiting to carry us back to Egypt. From there, we would make it back to the States and think of something else. It was a sad, quiet, introspective flight. When we arrived in the States, we transloaded to a couple of C-130s for the short hop to our CIA site. All of B Squadron sat in the aft part of our plane for takeoff. The loadmaster waved his arms and yelled that half of us had to move forward, but we told him to go to hell. No one was about to budge from a seat near those life-saving jump doors. Back at camp, we lounged in our hideaway while the controversy of the failed attempt raged on outside. This was the beginning of the frenetically dramatized news coverage that is now so much a part of our national being. And as we watched and listened to the television commentators endlessly chewing the event, I remarked to JT, "Man, we were the ones who caused all this." One Sunday morning, President Carter came to visit us. Up until then, he had been a remote figure, but following his visit, we became very fond of him and had a lot of respect and affection for the man. He told us he accepted full responsibility for what had happened, and that there would be no witch hunts as far as we were concerned. But there was a funny little side note to the president's visit. Carter was accompanied on his trip by Zbigniew Brzezinski, the president's national security advisor. The president walked through our assembled ranks, speaking with us individually, and Brzezinski followed along in his wake. That's when we noticed that Brzezinski, though dressed in a business suit, was wearing a pair of bright green, high-rubber boots, the kind you wear for mucking out stables or slopping hogs. My mate, Bronislaw Urbonsky, was on my immediate right, and as Carter stopped to speak with me, I could hear Brzezinski and Bronislaw chatting in Polish. After the politicos had departed, I asked Bronny what he had said to his compatriot. He replied with delight, "I asked Brzezinski why he was wearing those stupid-looking boots, and he told me, the president called me just a few minutes before we left Washington and said, 'I want you to come with me, we're going to the farm.' And I thought..." The CIA site we were using is nicknamed The Farm. When we finally returned to Fort Bragg, we were told to go away, to disappear for 2 weeks, and then call in for instructions. Until then, we were to lie low, avoid the press, and relax. And that's just what I did, with a fishing pole, a small boat, and 19 fat Georgia bass the first day. Deaths at Desert One, 25 April 1980. Marine Corps. Staff Sergeant Dewey L. Johnson, Dublin, Georgia. Sergeant John D. Harvey, Roanoke, Virginia. Corporal George N. Holmes, Pine Bluff, Arkansas. Air Force. Tech Sergeant Joel C. Mayo, Roseville, Michigan. Major Richard L. Bakke, Long Beach, California. Major Harold L. Lewis, Fort Walton Beach, Florida. Captain Charles T. McMillan, Corrigan, Tennessee. Captain Lynn D. McIntosh, Valdosta, Georgia. Aftermath.
And that was the disaster in Iran from Inside Delta Force by Eric Haney, Command Sergeant Major, retired. Back in a minute.
Thank you. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States. Today, bidding adios to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there, and reminding you to be honest, smart, and beautiful, and remember that the left has no authority, no power, and they can't win.